Hi, everyone. It's Thomas Renee, the head of voice and speech at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and the founder and CEO of the kineticfoundry.com. Today's video is for our Korean viewers out there, or specifically those Korean speakers who are learning or have learned English and want to keep moving their English accent in the direction of sounding more like they're from the United States, an accent that we might call General American. A lot of debate on that term. But if you're looking for a General American accent, I want to talk about a very specific instance within this accent that I find a lot of my Korean clients find difficult. And that is the distinction between consonant R and consonant L, R and L or L. It's so complex. There's so much to actually discuss here. So I don't want to make this too long of a video. So I'm going to kind of truncate it down to why. Why is this happening? Why do many people find this really difficult? And I want to compare the languages a little bit. So that's all I'm going to talk about today. And then I'll develop more videos to really break down the actual occurrences and the realizations of how those sounds happen so that you can continue to work on those sounds. But let's first just look at Korean versus English and why what's happening in Korean and why what's happening in English don't agree so much, and why it might be confusing for someone who has those skill sets of the Korean language coming into the new skill sets of English. So I'm just going to share my whiteboard here. I just have a couple things that I want us to look at. First, I already mentioned what we're looking at in English, so let's just focus on the left side of the screen here for a moment, English, and we're specifically talking about two sounds, consonant R, R, like in the word row, or we can find, depending how you say it in English, in the word arrow, the R, and it's represented by this symbol, this letter that we call R. And I also want to look at the sound L or L that we find in the beginning of the word luck, at the middle of the word palace, and at the end of the word pull. Now, I should flag that there are some differences in the realizations of these L's depending on where they are in the word, but I think that's outside of the scope of this video. But I'm just kind of putting an asterisk here for us to discuss in a later video. But for now, let's just look at the difference between R and L. Something that I want us to go to is actually this symbol. Now, if we check out the right side of the screen in Korean, this letter or symbol, or how would you say it? Would you call it a letter if we're talking about Korean written language? Let me know. But looking at this symbol, and what I think is so fascinating is actually this symbol gets represented in a couple of different ways. So if we look at a word like, excuse my pronunciation, I do not speak Korean, unfortunately, but something like baram. So we have that baram, da ara, ara, ara here, versus a word like bal, where we have the same letter or symbol in these two words, but they actually are representing two very different sounds. Param, la ara, 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 this tap, I'd call it an alveolar tap if that language isn't familiar to you, this tap against that gum ridge behind the teeth. And then we have pal, where the tongue touches that same place, but it doesn't tap, it doesn't pull away, it touches and the air flows around the tongue instead. And so I think within this representation of sound with this particular symbol, this to me is where the confusion lies for those Korean speakers who are coming to English and getting this RL situation a little confused and finding it as a skill set hard to master, is that we have ara and la 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 that's represented by the same symbol, almost under the same kind of concept within your linguistic understanding of the language. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. The ara, ara, ara is a separate conversation really from what we're talking about today, the sound in param. But what's interesting to me is that for many speakers, not just Korean, but for many, many languages, but for those who are coming from Korean, when we come to English, we often hear people represent this R sound, this R sound with this ara sound. So we'll get arrow instead of arrow. Now, a lot of speakers might immediately start to move towards the whatever that is, that more US-based English sound. But some people don't make that leap, and they represent, or they start to make this with that ara sound. That's really interesting. I'm just going to leave that there. No more explanation besides that happens. But then I do think this is also interesting that in the word pal, we have the ul that's actually here in the words like luck, palace, and pull. But I think what doesn't fully cross for everyone is that we have in English two separate categories linguistically of or r, I should say, and la, that consonant r, and consonant la. And we only have one linguistic concept of this symbol representing a couple different realizations of sound, such as the word param, ara, and pal, la, right there. So I think for a lot of people coming from this singular understanding of that concept, it then gets confused between these two, where many Korean speakers in English will start to put an la sound into a word like row or arrow. And people might then also take the concept of r into a word like luck, palace, or pull. And so that L starts to move to the R place, that R starts to move to the L place. And so what I'd like to see if we can just accomplish right now is this idea that R, represented in English by this symbol, R, is its own concept. It's its own understanding of a consonant. And L or La is it also similarly, but separately, its own concept of a consonant. That and luck, palace, and pull are one thing, and row and arrow, are its own thing. Yeah, I think that's it. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping that's helpful to even at least start the conversation on why that might be happening for you, if it is happening for you. And then the next step, I think, would be then to say, okay, I know that I have this ara and I have this l, such as in param and pal, but when I come over to English and I look at things like row and luck, I can separate those out, but now how do I actually do that and make sure that my tongue and my speech action is as accurate as possible? All right, well then I'll catch you in the next video, and I hope that was helpful. But till then, keep practicing. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.